"I didn't invite her, she embarrasses me," my sister whispered to her friend at her graduation party. Years later, she stood outside a prison, shaking. When the judge appeared, she gasped. I removed my robe and said, "You're lucky this time. I still love you." The auditorium was alive with applause, laughter, and the shimmer of flash photography. High school graduates crossed the stage one by one, clutching diplomas with trembling hands, their smiles wide and beaming. In the corner of the room, half hidden behind a tall marble column, stood Rebecca. She wore a pale blue dress, ironed the night before, and held a small, neatly wrapped box with a simple ribbon. The gift was modest, a leather-bound journal and a pen with Madison's initials engraved. She had thought long about what to bring, even if she hadn't been invited. It wasn't the first time Rebecca had stood in the background. She had learned how to blend into the scenery long ago. From birthday parties where she lit the candles but wasn't mentioned in the toasts, to Christmas mornings when Madison's pile of gifts dwarfed her own, Rebecca had become something of a fixture, present but often unnoticed. Madison was everything Rebecca wasn't. She was golden-haired, outspoken, the kind of girl who made heads turn when she walked into a room. Teachers adored her, classmates idolized her, and family always seemed to compare Rebecca to her without even realizing it. Madison played varsity soccer, starred in the school musical, and still had time to run a popular social media page filled with bright smiles and well-filtered perfection. Rebecca, on the other hand, kept to herself. She read, she wrote, she observed the world from a quiet distance. That evening, as the final names were called and Madison walked across the stage to cheers loud enough to rattle the windows, Rebecca felt both pride and a pang of something she couldn't quite name. She clapped softly from her shadowed corner, careful not to draw attention. Her presence wasn't required. Madison had made that clear weeks ago. No formal invite had arrived, no save the date text. Still, Rebecca came, because despite everything, she was still her sister. After the ceremony ended and the crowd poured into the lobby for photos and congratulations, Rebecca weaved carefully through the edge of the crowd, looking for the right moment to give her gift and leave. She spotted Madison in a tight circle of friends, laughing as someone popped a bottle of sparkling cider. For a second, she considered turning back, but just as she took a step forward, she froze. Madison's voice rang out, clear and casual. "No, I didn't invite her," she said, flipping her hair over one shoulder. "She embarrasses me, always standing around like she's invisible. It's awkward, you know?" Rebecca didn't move. She felt the words hit her chest like a gentle slap. Not violent, not loud, just enough to sting. The group laughed politely, and Madison's attention quickly shifted elsewhere. But the echo of that sentence lingered, curling around Rebecca's ribs. She turned slowly, walking back the way she had come, careful not to draw attention. The gift remained in her hands, unopened, ribbons still in place. Outside, the sun was setting, casting a warm gold across the parking lot. Rebecca stood by her car for a moment, looking down at the box. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened the passenger door and placed it on the seat. She didn't cry. Instead, she sat behind the wheel, hands gripping it tightly, eyes fixed on the horizon. There was no dramatic vow, no whispered declaration of revenge or transformation. Only a quiet, steady pulse of thought in her mind, that she was tired of being a ghost. That maybe, just maybe, she didn't need anyone else to see her. Not right now. She would see herself. She would build something, piece by piece, not to impress or prove, but simply to matter. And if no one ever noticed, that would be fine, because she would know. As she drove away from the ceremony, the laughter and noise fading into the distance, Rebecca allowed herself one final glance in the rearview mirror. Not at Madison, she was already swallowed by the crowd, but at herself, her own eyes, her own reflection. It was time to start something, not loud, not grand, just real, and hers. In the months that followed the graduation, Rebecca's world became smaller, more focused, and strangely, more peaceful. Without the emotional weight of trying to belong or be seen, she gave herself fully to the one thing she had always found refuge in: learning. Her world was built in library corners, scribbled notes in the margins of second-hand textbooks, and late nights hunched over her desk under the dim light of a thrifted lamp. She did not speak of Madison's words to anyone, not because she was trying to protect her sister, but because there was nothing more to say. What had been heard could not be unheard, and what had been felt would not be forgotten, but it would no longer define her. Rebecca enrolled at a local university with the help of a merit-based scholarship and took on a part-time job at a downtown cafe that paid just enough to keep her afloat. Each morning began before sunrise. She would open the cafe, serve the early rush of customers with polite efficiency, then attend classes, take notes with fierce precision, and spend her evenings reading case studies or writing essays. Her professors quickly took note of her. She wasn't loud in discussions, but when she spoke, her insights were sharp, deliberate, and thoughtful. Her classmates often underestimated her, a habit she stopped trying to correct. While other students posted pictures of their social lives or argued in group chats about trivial assignments, Rebecca kept her focus narrow. There was no time for distractions, no time for self-pity or idle wondering about who was invited to what. The hurt lingered, but it had been repurposed, transformed. Every rejection became fuel, every invisible moment a reason to push forward. She started volunteering at the campus legal aid clinic during her second year. The work was tedious at times, involving endless filing and paperwork, but Rebecca loved the clarity of it. Rules, processes, logic. The law made sense to her in a way that people sometimes didn't. She found satisfaction in structure, in knowing that effort led to outcome, that time invested would eventually yield results. Her mentors were quietly impressed. One of the clinic supervisors, an older attorney named Mr. Grant, began giving her more complex tasks, trusting her with early drafts of client letters and research memos. He once told her, "You see things other people miss, that's rare." Rebecca didn't reply. She simply nodded and got back to work. Over time, the distance between her and Madison widened, not out of anger, but from the sheer difference in their worlds. Madison had moved to a larger city for college, her social media filled with nights out, new clothes, smiling faces. She had changed majors twice, and once posted a caption about starting her own brand soon, though no details followed. They spoke only occasionally, mostly through brief text exchanges on holidays or shared family announcements. Their parents still compared them, although now the comparisons were more subtle, hidden behind questions like, "Are you eating well?" or "Do you have time for fun?" that hinted at concern masked as curiosity. Rebecca rarely answered in full. She didn't mind being misunderstood anymore. What mattered was what she understood about herself. In her third year, she took on a heavier academic load to finish early. She interned at a public defender's office, worked 2 jobs over the summer, and applied for early admission to law school. She studied for the LSAT with quiet obsession, her scores improving with each practice round until she reached the threshold she had set for herself, one high enough to silence any doubt, even the kind that still whispered in her own mind. One evening, while waiting for a bus after a long shift, Rebecca took out her phone and checked the admissions portal. The letter had arrived. She had been accepted. Full ride, top of her class, even before classes began. She did not cry. She did not post. She did not call anyone. She simply looked at the confirmation screen and let the moment settle. It was hers. Not because anyone had given it to her, not because she had been expected to achieve it, but because she had willed it into existence, alone, quietly, unseen. There were days when the memory of that graduation night would resurface, not as pain anymore, but as a reminder. It had planted something in her, not bitterness, but resolve, not vengeance, but purpose. And though she never sought out Madison or tried to rewrite what had happened between them, Rebecca knew that her life was moving forward in a way that could not be denied. People began to notice, professors, supervisors, even fellow students who had once overlooked her now asked for her input, her feedback, her guidance. She remained composed, never letting the new attention distort her focus. Validation was not the goal. Growth was. As she prepared to enter her final year before law school, she began drafting her personal statement. She struggled to begin, unsure how to frame her story without sounding bitter or boastful. After several failed drafts, she typed a single sentence that stopped her. I am not the loudest voice in the room, but I listen more carefully than most. That was it. That was who she was. Not invisible, not lesser, just different. And finally, that was enough. Time moved forward with quiet inevitability. Rebecca stepped into law school with the same quiet intensity that had carried her through her undergraduate years. There was no need to announce anything. Her routine remained as disciplined as ever. Early mornings dedicated to reading, afternoons filled with lectures and legal clinics, nights reserved for writing and reflection. Though the coursework was demanding, she felt no fear. Hard work was no stranger. What once felt like a burden now felt like a path. Steady, deliberate, hers alone. Meanwhile, Madison lived in a different rhythm entirely. After briefly enrolling in college, she changed majors more than once, each transition accompanied by a new burst of enthusiasm that eventually dimmed. First it was fashion marketing, then business communications, then a vague interest in entrepreneurship that resulted in a blog she abandoned within weeks. Her charm had not faded. She could still light up a room, still collect admirers like flowers. But something behind her smile had begun to shift. She was moving fast, but not necessarily forward. Rebecca knew bits and pieces through their parents, who still tried to bridge the silence between the sisters with casual updates. Madison's trying something new again, their mother would say, never without a note of concern. She's creative, you know, just trying to find her place. Rebecca listened without offering much. She had learned long ago that comparison, even unspoken, was a weight she didn't need to carry. Their paths rarely crossed. Holidays were awkward but polite, marked by brief conversations and an invisible wall that neither seemed interested in breaking. Madison spoke mostly about people, friends, events, the stress of working on a launch for a boutique business she rarely named in detail. Rebecca spoke little. Her life, though full, didn't lend itself easily to casual storytelling. Contracts, case law, mock trials, these were not things that made for light dinner conversation. Still, there was no open hostility. Just a distance formed not from anger, but from time, choices, and the quiet understanding that they had grown into different people entirely. And yet, the memory of that night, the words Rebecca had overheard, remained tucked in the silence between them, never spoken, but never gone. During one winter break, Rebecca was offered a position at a non-profit legal firm that handled immigration and housing cases. It was her first real taste of fieldwork. She interviewed clients, drafted legal documents, and sat in on consultations where real lives hung in the balance. The work was heavy, the hours long, but she thrived in it. She found clarity in the challenge, purpose in the complexity. For the first time, she felt not just competent, but vital. Across the state, Madison was renting a small apartment with a friend she had met at a networking event. Her business, a pop-up home decor brand marketed through curated social media campaigns, had launched with some early buzz, but quickly ran into problems. Shipping delays, inventory issues, unclear pricing. She masked the stress with curated posts and filtered captions, but the cracks were starting to show. She was chasing something, success, approval, maybe even identity, but never staying still long enough to find it. The sisters' lives moved on, each unaware of the details behind the other's daily grind. Madison didn't know the weight of Rebecca's cases, the lives she was trying to protect through late-night research and courtroom prep. Rebecca didn't know the mounting pressure Madison felt as suppliers demanded payments and customers sent complaints she didn't know how to handle. They moved like two trains on separate tracks, close enough to glimpse but never intersecting. Rebecca graduated law school with honors. She accepted a position at a small but reputable legal practice specializing in civil litigation. It wasn't glamorous, but it was good, solid work. She rented a modest apartment, filled it with second-hand furniture and quiet joy. Each victory, no matter how small, felt earned. She did not chase recognition. The work itself was enough. At the same time, Madison's online following began to plateau. Her brand no longer held the novelty it once did. Investors she had hoped to attract moved on. She tried pivoting to new ventures, digital workshops, affiliate marketing, a half-hearted podcast, but none of it stuck. Her apartment grew quieter, the calls from suppliers more insistent. She had always been the center of attention, but attention was no longer enough. It was during this period that Rebecca's name began to circulate in local legal circles. She was respected for her clarity, her calm, her focus. Clients trusted her, not because she promised easy outcomes, but because she listened, explained, and delivered. Her reputation grew slowly, like roots beneath the surface, strong and unseen. Years passed. Madison's ventures faded, restarted, failed again. Rebecca's career advanced, her client list expanding with each case she handled. She didn't notice how far she had come until a former professor invited her to guest lecture at the university. Standing at the front of the room, facing rows of eager students, she realized she had become the kind of person she once admired. Not famous, not flashy, just quietly excellent, and still they remained distant. Neither sister knew how to bridge the years. Pride stood between them like a locked door neither was ready to open. Yet the difference between them was not simply success or failure. It was how they had chosen to respond to being lost. Rebecca had built herself a compass. Madison was still searching for one. What neither of them knew, what neither of them could predict, was that life, in its strange and unrelenting way, would bring them together again. Not through a dramatic twist or family emergency, but through something much more ordinary and therefore more inevitable, a chance encounter. And in that moment, everything would begin to shift. The town square was alive with weekend energy. It was one of those early spring afternoons when the air carried the scent of fresh grass and distant food trucks. Local artisans lined the cobblestone paths, selling handmade soaps, candles, and prints of watercolor skylines. Rebecca had no plans to attend the community event, but found herself wandering through it after finishing an early morning client meeting nearby. Dressed in a neutral blazer and practical flats, she blended in with the casual crowd, just another passerby stopping briefly at booths before moving on. She didn't usually linger in crowds. She preferred the quiet efficiency of her office or the structured intensity of a courtroom. But something about the weather, or perhaps the simplicity of the market, made her pause. She let herself slow down for once. A small stall caught her attention. Vintage book covers turned into journals. She ran her fingers along the worn leather of a classic spine and smiled softly. The vendor greeted her politely, but Rebecca's attention was suddenly pulled away by a voice she hadn't heard clearly in years, but one her mind recognized immediately. "Wait, Rebecca?" She turned slowly. Madison stood a few feet away, a tote bag slung over her shoulder, sunglasses pushed back on her head. Her expression was frozen between surprise and something unreadable. The smile she wore seemed automatic, the kind people wear when they're not sure what else to do. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Rebecca took in the scene with measured calm. Madison looked the same in many ways, styled, put together, effortlessly in place. But there was something behind her eyes, a kind of unsettled flicker, as if she were trying to hold something together with the sheer force of will. "I didn't know you came to things like this," Madison said finally, stepping closer. Her voice was light, too practiced. "I was nearby," Rebecca replied. "Didn't plan on it." "Well, it's kind of charming, right?" Madison gestured vaguely to the rows of stalls. "Local talent, small business, that kind of thing." Rebecca nodded, but said nothing. A brief silence settled between them. The noise of the crowd pressed in. Laughter, music from a nearby stage, the hum of conversations, but around them there was a strange stillness. Madison cleared her throat. "You look good. Professional." Rebecca tilted her head slightly. "Thank you. You too." The politeness felt foreign, like borrowed language. They had once shared secrets whispered under blankets as children, had giggled over inside jokes, fought over bathroom space, and dreamed aloud in the back seat of long car rides. But those memories belonged to a version of them that no longer existed. Madison tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "So, law, right? You're doing that full-time now?" Rebecca gave a small nod. "Yes, civil work, mostly housing and small business disputes." "That's amazing," Madison said too quickly. "I mean, really, I've always said you were the smart one." Rebecca didn't respond to the compliment. She wasn't sure it was meant to be sincere or just something to fill space. "What about you?" she asked instead, keeping her tone neutral. "Oh, still juggling a few things," Madison replied, smiling a little too brightly. I've been working on some ideas, trying to get traction again. You know how it is. Starting something new, pushing forward, pivoting. It's all part of the process, right? Rebecca didn't press. She heard the phrases, traction, pivoting, and recognized them for what they were. Words meant to conceal uncertainty. Still, she didn't judge. She remembered what it felt like to try to shape a future from scraps. "Well," Madison continued, her voice softening slightly, "it's good to see you. Really, I know we've both been busy, but—" She trailed off, the sentence unfinished. Rebecca nodded again, not out of coldness, but because she didn't have anything better to say. They stood like that for another moment, two sisters held in place by an invisible thread of shared history and long-standing silence. Around them, the market went on. Children laughed as they chased each other with balloons. Musicians played near the fountain. None of it touched the space between them. Madison hesitated before speaking again. "Hey, do you still have your office downtown, on 4th? Rebecca blinked. "Yes. Why?" I don't want to get into anything here," Madison said, suddenly looking anywhere but at her. "But I might stop by soon, if that's okay." Rebecca didn't ask why. She didn't demand an explanation. She simply said, "Sure. If you need to talk, you know where to find me." Madison gave a small, grateful nod, then glanced over her shoulder. "I should get going. My friend's waiting." She gestured toward a woman by a food truck who was pretending not to watch. Rebecca offered a polite farewell. "Take care, Madison." "You too," her sister replied, before turning and walking away. Rebecca watched her go, then turned back to the stall of vintage journals. She picked one up, flipped through the pages, and purchased it without another thought. As she walked away from the booth, the weight of the brief encounter settled in her chest. Not heavy, but not light either. Something had changed. Not dramatically, not permanently, but enough to notice. The knock came on a Tuesday, just after 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Rebecca had just finished a phone consultation with a local tenant dispute case and was organizing a stack of client files on her desk when she heard it. 3 short taps, hesitant, unsure. Her office, modest but orderly, sat on the 2nd floor of an old converted building with creaky stairs and a flickering hallway light that still hadn't been fixed. The receptionist had already left for the day. Rebecca expected no one. When she opened the door, Madison stood there. She wore a beige trench coat over jeans and a fitted top, her hair pulled back with strands falling loose around her face. Her expression was tight, her lips pressed together as if holding back a question or an apology. Rebecca stepped aside without a word, allowing her to enter. The room grew quieter as the door clicked shut. Madison looked around slowly. The office was simple. A desk, 2 chairs, a wall shelf lined with law books and case files, and a single plant by the window. It wasn't showy, but it was a space built by purpose, not decoration. "You've done well," Madison said quietly, still not meeting her sister's eyes. "Sit," Rebecca replied, gesturing toward the chair opposite her desk. Madison obeyed, setting her tote bag carefully at her feet, fingers fidgeting in her lap. She looked older in that moment, not aged, but stripped of the effortless glow she always carried in public. For the first time in years, Rebecca saw not the curated version of Madison, but the unguarded one. "I don't want to take up much of your time," Madison began, voice thin. "I know you're busy, I didn't know who else to talk to." Rebecca sat down across from her, folding her hands on the desk. She didn't speak. Madison seemed to need silence more than words. "I messed up," Madison said after a pause. "That's what it comes down to. I made some decisions without understanding what I was doing. I trusted people I shouldn't have. I ignored things I thought didn't matter, because I was so focused on making it look like everything was working." Rebecca listened, still not interrupting. "I registered my business under my name, took out some credit, launched a bunch of campaigns online. It started fine, you know? There was buzz. Sales were okay. But then things started piling up. Orders that got delayed, suppliers asking for more upfront, software fees, taxes I didn't realize I had to pay. I kept pushing forward, thinking I'd fix it once I made more sales, but it never balanced out." She paused, exhaling slowly, then continued. "I didn't track everything the way I should have. I didn't file for the right licenses. I missed some quarterly tax deadlines, and then I got a letter from the state about penalties. Then another one. And now, I'm scared. I don't know what's going to happen. Her voice cracked slightly at the end. Rebecca noted the tremor, but didn't move. I haven't told Mom or Dad, Madison added, her eyes flicking toward the window. I didn't want the judgment, or the questions, or the disappointment. I thought maybe if I could just fix it before they found out. Rebecca leaned back slightly in her chair. Her tone was steady. How far behind are you? I don't even know, Madison admitted. I mean, I have some of the paperwork. I brought what I could. It's all in my bag. She bent down and pulled out a slim folder, its edges worn and papers disorganized. She set it on the desk and pushed it toward Rebecca, who opened it and began scanning quickly. Invoices, notices, a warning from the city clerk's office, an email printout about a missed payment. Nothing criminal, not yet, but enough to cause serious financial and legal strain if ignored. Rebecca closed the folder and looked up. How long has this been going on? About a year, Madison whispered. I kept thinking I'd get ahead of it, but I didn't. Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken memories. For a moment, Rebecca thought back to the girl Madison used to be. Always confident, always the center of attention, always certain that everything would work out because it always had. This version of her was smaller, humbled, yet somehow more real. I'm not asking you to fix it, Madison added quickly, her voice rising with urgency. I thought you could tell me what's going to happen, what I should do, what I can't ignore anymore. Rebecca nodded slowly. This isn't irreversible. Not yet. But you need to stop treating this like something you can spin your way out of. It's not a post or a launch, it's paperwork, it's records, it's deadlines. Madison blinked. I know. You'll need to be honest with the authorities, Rebecca continued. That means amending filings, paying penalties where required, possibly negotiating payment plans. It will be tedious. It will take time. But if you commit to it, you can come out on the other side. Madison swallowed hard. Will I be sued? Unlikely, Rebecca said, unless you've taken money without delivering products or misrepresented financials to investors. I haven't, Madison said quickly. Just bad management. Rebecca nodded again. Then we can work with that. The words felt strange in her mouth. We. She hadn't meant to offer herself, not really, but as she looked across the desk at her sister, she saw not a rival or a reminder of old pain, but someone genuinely lost, someone who had finally asked for help. Madison looked up. You'd help me? Even after... Rebecca held her gaze. I'm not helping you as your sister. I'm helping you as someone who understands what it means to fall behind and still keep moving. Madison blinked fast, eyes shining, but no tears fell. She nodded, silently accepting the terms. Rebecca reached for a pen. We start with organizing this. Then we make a list. And for the first time in years, the silence between them felt less like distance and more like space waiting to be filled. Rebecca's desk became a battlefield, not of anger or conflict, but of paperwork and order, a war fought with highlighters, timelines, and folders labeled in crisp capital letters. In the days following Madison's confession, the pile of documents grew steadily, each one revealing another layer of the tangled mess her sister had unintentionally created. Rebecca stayed methodical. She separated receipts from invoices, cross-referenced bank statements, flagged missing documentation, and created a chronological file to track every relevant date and financial movement. Madison came by daily. She never stayed longer than necessary, and rarely spoke unless prompted, but she showed up on time and brought what was asked of her. In the beginning, her presence made the room feel strained. She was still visibly carrying shame, and Rebecca, for all her composure, hadn't yet decided how to process the sudden closeness after years apart. But the routine of their work, the mutual focus, the shared investment in solving something complex, created a rhythm between them. It wasn't friendship, not yet. It wasn't healing either. It was cooperation, and it held its own kind of fragile peace. Rebecca explained each step clearly, never assuming knowledge. She taught Madison how to create spreadsheets that tracked outgoing payments and incoming sales. She outlined the risks of ignoring city regulations and walked her through the process of correcting late filings with the state revenue office. There were late nights when both of them sat in silence, the only sound being the scratch of pen on paper, or the occasional frustrated sigh when a number didn't match or a form required resubmission. Rebecca didn't coddle. Madison didn't resist. The deeper they went, the more Rebecca understood the extent of her sister's situation. There had been no theft, no deliberate fraud, but rather an accumulation of poor decisions born from haste and naivety. Madison had believed that her charm, her intuition and her public enthusiasm would carry her through the growing pains of entrepreneurship. But beneath the branding and the marketing, there had been no real structure, no grasp of taxes, no understanding of permits, no contingency plans. "I didn't think I needed help," Madison admitted once, after a particularly long evening. "I thought needing help meant I wasn't good enough." Rebecca didn't answer right away. She looked up from the spreadsheet she was editing and simply said, "Everyone needs help. The difference is whether they ask in time." That silence afterward wasn't awkward. It was mutual. Understanding passed between them in a way that felt cleaner than words. Eventually, the situation reached a point where Rebecca had to escalate. The financial discrepancies required formal attention. Notices from the Revenue Department and the city's business bureau were no longer warnings but demands. Rebecca contacted a colleague who specialized in business law to get a second opinion. She reviewed Madison's entire file, carefully checking for anything that could result in criminal charges. Thankfully, nothing crossed that line, but it was close. "You could have ended up in court," Rebecca said during one of their strategy sessions. "Not civil court, criminal. If you had misreported your earnings one more time, they could have investigated." Madison looked down. "I didn't even know I was misreporting." "That doesn't matter," Rebecca replied. "Ignorance doesn't protect you from legal consequences." The words weren't harsh, but they struck hard. Madison nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of what might have been. They filed amendments together. Rebecca coached Madison through emails to state agents, drafted a written statement of responsibility, and submitted applications for extensions and payment plans. Each task was followed by another. Nothing moved quickly. Bureaucracy rarely did, but progress came inch by inch, form by form. One afternoon, while organizing receipts by date, Madison looked across the desk and asked, "Why are you really doing this? You said it wasn't because we're sisters." Rebecca didn't stop what she was doing. "Because I can," she said, "and because you asked." Madison opened her mouth to respond, but closed it again. There was no answer to that kind of truth, only gratitude, quiet, unspoken, and real. As the weeks passed, the tension in Rebecca's office began to shift. The room no longer felt like a place for confessions or damage control. It became a space of construction. They were no longer digging themselves out of a hole. They were building something new. Madison began arriving with fewer signs of panic. Her questions became more precise. She started keeping her own lists, tracking deadlines, even correcting herself when she made errors. The learning curve was steep, but she climbed it. Despite the progress, the outside world began to stir. A summons arrived. Not a lawsuit, but a notice of a pending compliance hearing with the local Business Regulation Board. It wasn't unexpected. Rebecca had warned Madison this might happen as part of the review process. But seeing the formal seal and the hearing date printed in bold startled her. "Do I have to go?" Madison asked, clutching the envelope tightly. "Yes," Rebecca said. "You'll need to appear. They're not looking to punish you. They're trying to understand how far off course you went and whether you're correcting it." Madison looked pale. "Will I have to speak?" "You'll have to tell the truth," Rebecca replied. "That's more important." They spent the next 2 weeks preparing for the hearing. Rebecca compiled a binder of corrections, proof of repayments, revised documents, and written apologies. She rehearsed with Madison, asking mock questions until the answers came without stammering. Madison still doubted herself, still hesitated, but she showed up every day. That was more than Rebecca had expected. On the day of the hearing, Madison wore a muted gray blazer and carried the binder herself. Rebecca walked beside her to the building but didn't enter. She wasn't on the case formally, and it wasn't her place. As Madison turned to face the panel alone, Rebecca watched from the entrance, her hands folded, face unreadable. Madison entered the hearing room. A storm had come, but she wasn't hiding from it anymore. The hearing lasted less than an hour, but for Madison, Time stretched unnaturally inside that modest municipal room. The panel consisted of 3 local officials seated behind a long table, each with a folder containing copies of the documents Rebecca had meticulously prepared. Madison stood alone before them, her binder clutched tightly in both hands, her heart pounding in a slow, persistent rhythm that made it hard to breathe evenly. She had rehearsed answers. Rebecca had walked her through possible questions, corrected her phrasing, refined her explanations. But nothing had fully prepared Madison for the vulnerability of standing alone, exposed not just by the paperwork, but by the truth that followed her into the room. The truth of having built something carelessly, of having leaned too hard on hope and image without enough substance underneath. When the lead official, a woman with a calm, unreadable tone, asked, "Do you acknowledge that your business failed to meet operational compliance over the past fiscal year?" Madison answered clearly, "Yes, I do. I was negligent, but not intentionally so. I've learned from that. I've taken steps to correct the damage." She handed over the binder, her hands slightly trembling, and watched as they opened it page by page. They asked about missing filings, uncollected sales tax, overdue city permits. Madison answered everything as instructed. No excuses, just facts, accountability, and proof of efforts to make things right. For the first time in her adult life, she wasn't selling a brand or telling a story. She was simply showing up for herself, with everything laid bare. When it was over, she stepped out into the corridor, the air cool against her flushed skin. Rebecca was there, seated on a bench, a book unopened in her lap. She stood as soon as she saw Madison's face. "How did it go?" Madison exhaled slowly. "I didn't collapse, if that's what you mean." Rebecca allowed the smallest curve of a smile. "Then it went well enough." They didn't speak much during the short walk back to Rebecca's office. There was nothing to dissect yet, no verdict, no penalties assigned. They would receive the outcome in writing within 10 business days. Until then, all they could do was wait. But something had shifted in that silence between them, the kind of shift that isn't marked by grand declarations or apologies, but by simple acts, showing up, standing tall, doing the hard thing despite the fear. Back at the office, Rebecca returned to her usual tasks while Madison sat across from her, visibly more grounded than she had been days earlier. She no longer looked like someone trying to avoid reality. She looked like someone who had entered the storm and come through, not untouched but intact. "I know I still have work to do," Madison said after a long pause, her voice steady. "Even if the panel gives me a pass, there's still everything else. Taxes, vendors, the brand itself." Rebecca looked up from her screen. "Yes, it's not finished, but the hardest part, facing it, that's done." Madison nodded. She seemed to want to say more, but chose instead to open her laptop and begin drafting a new business operations plan. Rebecca noticed. She said nothing but took quiet note of the choice. Madison wasn't just fixing things because she had to. She was rebuilding with intention. In the weeks that followed, they continued to work side by side. Madison brought coffee in the mornings. Rebecca showed her how to draft basic contracts. They talked occasionally, not about the past, not yet, but about neutral things, local news, a book Madison was reading, a podcast Rebecca had heard about but hadn't listened to. It wasn't warmth exactly, but it wasn't tension either. It was the beginning of something that neither of them had been able to name for years. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the office glowed in golden light, Madison closed her laptop and looked across the desk. "You know," she said slowly, "there was a time when I thought you didn't like me." Rebecca didn't respond right away. She looked down at a case summary, closed the folder gently and met her sister's gaze. "I didn't know if you liked me either." The quiet between them wasn't heavy this time. It was reflective. "I didn't," Madison admitted, her voice honest but soft. "Not because of you, because I didn't like myself around you. You were solid. You knew who you were, and I never really did." Rebecca absorbed the words. They didn't erase the years of distance, the hurt, the overheard sentence at a graduation that had lingered for far too long. But they did something else. They gave context. They offered a bridge. "I didn't know who I was back then either," Rebecca said at last. "I just hid it better." The light outside faded into evening. For the first time, they both stayed a little longer than necessary, not because there was work left to finish, but because the silence no longer required escape. Their bond was not healed in full, Too much had been unsaid for too long, but the foundation had shifted. It was no longer held together by obligation or shared history alone. It was forming, slowly, cautiously, through respect. When Madison finally left for the night, Rebecca stood at the window for a long time, watching her walk down the street, disappear around the corner. The desk was quiet. The files were in order. And somewhere inside her, something had let go. Not of memory, not of caution, but of distance. In helping her sister navigate legal ruin, Rebecca had stepped into something unexpected. Not just the arena of professional challenge, but the delicate process of forgiving someone who may never have fully known how much they had been forgiven for. Spring turned into early summer with little fanfare. The days grew longer, and the routines that had once felt strained between the sisters became familiar, almost natural. Madison's business, though still recovering, had stabilized enough to allow her some space to breathe. She filed updated paperwork with the city, followed through on tax obligations, and even reached out to former clients with transparency and refunds where necessary. The damage could not be fully undone, but Rebecca often reminded her that accountability had its own quiet power. Madison listened. More importantly, she acted. One morning, Rebecca arrived at her office to find an envelope waiting on her desk. It was from the district court. She wasn't surprised. Her caseload had grown steadily over the past few months, and local clients continued to recommend her. She tore it open, expecting another hearing notice, only to find that it wasn't one of her ongoing cases. It was a new assignment, an administrative appointment to temporarily fill a seat as substitute judge for a municipal session due to a last-minute scheduling conflict in the court's rotation. Rebecca had served in that role before. Local bar associations often called on attorneys with strong records to act as short-term substitutes in civil court when judges were away. It was procedural work, preliminary hearings, motions, case reviews. It didn't require robes or long trials, just fairness, clarity, and calm under pressure. She accepted the assignment without hesitation. The hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday morning. Rebecca spent the weekend reviewing the docket, a standard packet of civil cases scheduled for brief examination. Most were routine: landlord disputes, small claims, licensing reviews. She worked through them methodically, making notes in the margins, drafting questions for clarification. It wasn't until Monday evening, while cross-checking the final case summary, that she saw it: Madison Grace Ellison. It was the very last name on the list. Rebecca stared at it in silence. It was not the same compliance hearing Madison had attended weeks earlier. That one had been administrative, handled by a city panel. This was a court summons, a follow-up issued due to an unresolved vendor claim tied to one of her earlier business failures. The notice had been mailed to Madison 2 weeks prior, likely before the panel's review was even finalized. Rebecca hadn't known. Madison hadn't mentioned it. Protocol was clear. If a judge had a personal connection to a case or to one of the parties involved, they could recuse themselves. In fact, it was expected. But in small districts where resources were limited and personal connections frequent, the rule left room for judgment, especially if the case hadn't yet been contested. Rebecca sat at her desk, long after the sun had gone down, staring at the docket, weighing her options. By morning, she had made her decision. She arrived at the courthouse early, dressed in a tailored navy suit, her notes tucked neatly into a folder. The court clerk greeted her warmly, escorted her to the temporary chambers, and offered a briefing on the day's schedule. Rebecca listened, nodded, reviewed, all with her usual composure. No one in the room knew that the final case of the morning involved her sister. No one suspected that the judge for the day was privately managing a storm of personal conflict behind her calm demeanor. As the session began, she moved through the docket efficiently. Plaintiffs and defendants rotated in and out of the courtroom, each presenting their claims, each addressed with Rebecca's quiet authority. She maintained professionalism, clarity, and fairness, just as she always had. And then the clerk called the final case. Case number 832, Madison Grace Ellison, vendor dispute filed by TrueCore Creative Supply. The room shifted. Rebecca looked up just as Madison stepped into the courtroom, her eyes locking onto her sister's across the bench. For a second, nothing moved. Madison froze mid-step, holding a file in her hand, her mouth slightly open in shock. The courtroom was silent except for the soft shuffle of papers from the opposing counsel's table. No one else understood what had just happened. Only the two sisters across the formality of robes and benches and years of history. Rebecca felt the weight of the moment settle across her shoulders, but she didn't flinch, she didn't look away. She simply nodded once, barely perceptible, and motioned for the room to come to order. Court is now in session. Her voice was clear, neutral, measured. Madison sat down slowly, her hands clenched tightly around the folder in her lap. The plaintiff's counsel presented the facts: a standing debt, unpaid invoices, and failure to deliver contracted branding materials. Madison listened, her face still pale, but her posture upright. When asked to respond, she stood, steady on her feet, and spoke clearly. "I acknowledge the debt. I've begun a structured repayment plan. I've submitted that plan and proof of initial payments. I'm asking for the case to be deferred until the agreement is completed." She didn't look at Rebecca once while speaking. Rebecca nodded, made notes, asked a few clarifying questions, her tone no different than with the previous 7 cases. Her professionalism was absolute. Still, the tension in the room was undeniable, not explosive but tightly coiled, like a wire stretched too far. When the presentation ended, Rebecca looked directly at Madison for the first time since the session began. Her gaze was steady, but her voice took on a slight edge of gravity, not unkind but unmistakably personal. "You're fortunate this dispute is being handled through civil channels," she said. "The court recognizes the effort to repay, but I advise you to treat every document you sign as legally binding. Casual oversight is not a defense." Madison nodded once, silent. Rebecca paused, then added in a voice quieter but no less firm, "You're lucky this time." The silence deepened. Then, after a breath, Rebecca said something else. Something not in the script, not from a judge, but from a sister. "I still love you." There was no reaction from Madison, not visibly, but the courtroom felt changed. Something had been said that belonged nowhere in legal procedure, and yet it echoed more powerfully than any verdict. Rebecca turned to the clerk. "We will take a brief recess." And with that, she stood and exited the courtroom. The hallway outside the courtroom was cool and quiet, the kind of quiet that felt suspended, not peace but pause. Rebecca stood near the window at the far end of the corridor, her arms crossed loosely, eyes fixed on the blurred reflection of the town outside the glass. She didn't move, didn't speak, didn't shift her weight. Everything in her posture suggested control, but inside her chest, something had cracked open the moment she saw Madison's name on the docket and chose, against instinct and protocol, to let the session proceed. She hadn't planned it. In fact, everything in her training told her to recuse herself. That was the standard. That was what would have been expected. But there was something about the convergence of that day, the courtroom, the formal process, and the quiet charge of truth that compelled her to stay seated. Perhaps it was stubbornness. Perhaps it was something else. She didn't know. All she knew was that for the first time in years, she had said aloud what had been buried beneath layers of silence and restraint. "I still love you." She had said it not as a legal statement, not as a professional declaration, but as something that had needed to be spoken without planning or permission. She wasn't sure if it had been fair, but it had been honest. The click of heels on polished tile broke the stillness. Madison appeared at the end of the hall, walking slowly, holding the same file from court pressed against her side. She didn't wear anger or confusion on her face, only a kind of disbelief, the expression of someone still processing the moment they just stepped through. Rebecca turned but didn't speak. "You weren't supposed to be there," Madison said after a long silence, stopping a few feet away. "I wasn't," Rebecca replied, her voice calm. "But I was assigned, and it wasn't contested. You could have stepped down." "I could have. Why didn't you?" Rebecca looked at her for a moment, then said, "Because I wanted you to see that I could hold both roles, the one I built and the one you ignored." Madison blinked. "I didn't ignore." "You didn't want to see it," Rebecca interrupted gently. "You didn't want to see me, not when it didn't serve whatever image you had of yourself." Madison's lips parted, but no words came. She stood there, the courthouse quiet around them, and for a moment she looked younger, not childish, but stripped of the adult performance she wore so naturally. The defenses weren't gone, but they were crumbling. "What you said," Madison finally whispered. "In there. Was that for the record?" Rebecca's gaze softened. "No, that was for you." Madison looked down at the floor, and for a long moment neither of them moved. The echo of their shared past hung in the air, the childhood they had weathered together, the adolescence that had split them apart, the years of silence filled with misunderstandings they never corrected. It was all there, in the space between them. "I never forgot," Madison said quietly. "That day, the graduation. What I said. You heard me, didn't you?" Rebecca nodded. "I did." Madison's eyes were glassy, but no tears fell. "I don't know why I said it. I was trying to feel important, to impress someone. I thought putting you down would make me look stronger." "It didn't," Rebecca said. "It just made you smaller." Madison winced. "I deserve that." "I'm not trying to hurt you," Rebecca continued. "But you need to understand the impact. You were the center of every room, every family gathering, every conversation, and I never asked to compete. I just wanted to exist, but even that was too much." "I was wrong," Madison said, her voice almost a whisper. "About you. About what mattered." The silence that followed wasn't hostile. It was necessary. Rebecca finally unfolded her arms. "I removed myself from the case. A new judge will be assigned. You'll get official notice by tomorrow." Madison nodded, her hands gripping the file tighter. "I figured. I wasn't ready to see you like that. I didn't think I'd ever be in a place where you were the one in charge." "I wasn't in charge," Rebecca said. "I was just doing my job." "But you're steady," Madison said slowly, choosing the word as if testing it aloud for the first time. "You've built something. I always thought I'd get there first." "You always thought you were already there." Madison gave a small, bitter laugh. "Yeah, I did." The sound faded. For the first time in years, they looked at each other not as symbols of resentment or history, but as two adults with the weight of their separate choices visible on their shoulders. It wasn't closure. It wasn't reconciliation. But it was a moment of recognition, unfiltered and sharp. Rebecca took a breath and said, "You can still fix what's broken, Madison, but you have to keep showing up. Every time." "I know," Madison replied, "and I will." There was no embrace, no dramatic ending, just the quiet resolution of two people learning at last to speak to each other without armor. Madison turned to leave, then paused and looked back. "You said you love me," she said. "That's still true?" Rebecca didn't smile, but her voice was warmer than it had been all day. "Yes, it always was. I just stopped saying it when I didn't think it would matter." Madison nodded. "It matters now." And then she was gone, her figure disappearing down the hallway and out into the sunlight. Rebecca remained by the window, watching the street, feeling the shift inside her chest. Not relief, not triumph, but clarity. Some storms don't end with thunder. They end with truth. The next morning, Rebecca arrived at her office earlier than usual. The sun had barely crested the horizon, casting pale gold light across the tops of buildings as the city began its slow hum. Inside her office, the air felt still, almost heavy with the residue of the previous day. She placed her bag beside her desk, opened the window just slightly to let in the fresh air, and stood in the silence for a while, letting the weight of recent events settle. Her decision to step down from Madison's case had been inevitable and correct. She had known from the beginning that she could not be both sister and judge. Still, something about the timing of it all had lodged itself in her thoughts. The courtroom, the confrontation, the quiet confession outside the chamber, it had left her with more questions than closure. She moved through her morning routine, email, calendar, calls to confirm appointments, but found herself distracted. Every message felt distant, every task mechanical. What lingered was not the professional obligation she had fulfilled, but the personal truth she had faced. Her words still echoed in her mind. "You're lucky this time. I still love you." They had been true, but they had also been unexpected, spoken not in vulnerability but in control, and yet they had shaken something loose inside her. By late morning, a letter arrived from the court. As predicted, it confirmed her formal recusal from Madison's case and noted the reassignment to another judge. The name was unfamiliar, someone from a nearby district. Efficient, fair, by the book. The outcome would likely be straightforward, especially now that Madison had submitted all necessary documentation. Rebecca read through the letter twice, then placed it in her filing cabinet. She didn't need to revisit it again. That afternoon, she closed the office early. It was unusual for her to take time off without cause, but she knew she needed space, not for rest, but for reflection. She walked the long route home, past the old post office, the public library, and the fountain at the edge of town square. She stopped by a small cafe she used to frequent during law school, ordered tea, and sat by the window, watching people pass by with bags, dogs, and conversations trailing behind them. For a while she did nothing. She simply watched and breathed and let the stillness do its quiet work. Her phone buzzed once. A message from Madison. "Do you have a moment? Can I come by?" Not for legal help. Rebecca stared at the screen, then typed back, "Tomorrow, 10 o'clock." The next morning, Madison arrived right on time. She wore simple jeans and a cardigan, hair pulled back, no makeup. She looked more at ease than Rebecca had expected. Not confident, but not burdened either. She carried no folder this time, no file, just herself. Rebecca gestured for her to sit, then closed her office door. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Madison broke the silence. "I thought about what you said." "I said a lot," Rebecca replied, her tone even. "You said you still loved me," Madison said, "and that I was lucky. You were right. About both." Rebecca said nothing, waiting. Madison leaned forward, her elbows on her knees. "I came here because I need to say something before the new judge makes any decisions. Not legally. I know that part's in motion now. But personally, because this isn't about the court anymore." Rebecca folded her hands on her desk. "Go on." Madison took a breath. "When we were younger, I always thought I had to outshine you. Not because you were loud or competitive, you weren't, but because I didn't understand how to exist next to someone like you. You were so complete. Even when people ignored you, you never chased attention. That scared me, because I always needed attention to feel real. I built everything around it, but it was hollow. And when it cracked, I realized I had nothing underneath." Rebecca's gaze didn't waver. "I resented you," Madison continued, her voice soft. "Not because you did anything wrong, but because you didn't need the approval I craved. I thought that made you cold. It didn't. It made you strong." Rebecca remained still, but her silence was no longer distant. It was listening. "I'm sorry," Madison said, her voice breaking slightly. "Not just for that day at graduation, but for every day after that when I chose silence instead of reaching out. I thought if I ignored what I said it would fade, but it never did. I've carried it every day." The weight of those words landed between them, not heavy with guilt but anchored by truth. Rebecca nodded slowly. "I forgave you a long time ago," she said, "but I didn't know how to say it without being asked." Madison swallowed, then looked down at her hands. Rebecca continued, "You've done the hard work. You faced what you ran from. That matters more than perfect timing. I want us to be sisters again," Madison said, "not just in name, but for real." Rebecca didn't smile, but something softened in her posture. She stood, walked to the small table by the window, and poured 2 cups of tea from the kettle she kept there. She handed one to Madison and sat across from her. "We don't have to be what we were," Rebecca said. "We just have to choose something better." Madison nodded. "I'd like that." And there it was. Not a reunion wrapped in ceremony or a dramatic reconciliation, but a decision. Quiet, intentional, real. The rest of the hour passed gently. They spoke not as lawyer and client, not even as judge and defendant, but simply as Rebecca and Madison. 2 women once divided by silence, now choosing to speak with care. As Madison left the office, Rebecca remained seated, watching the steam rise from her cup. For the first time in years, the past no longer felt like a wall. It felt like something they had walked through, together. The letter from the courthouse arrived quietly, folded in a plain white envelope, as if it carried no more weight than a utility bill or a marketing flyer. Madison brought it to Rebecca's office that morning, her steps calm, her eyes unreadable. She held the envelope carefully between her fingers, not opening it, as though doing so might change what it contained. Rebecca stood from her desk and motioned for her to sit. Neither of them rushed. They had waited for this, not anxiously, but with the solemn acceptance that comes when a final chapter of a long process nears its conclusion. The new judge had taken over Madison's case, reviewed her updated filings, and examined the payment agreements she had entered into with her vendor. It was no longer about guilt or punishment. The process had shifted toward resolution. Rebecca poured tea while Madison opened the envelope. Her fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded the single page. She read it silently, then handed it over without a word. Rebecca took the paper and scanned its contents. The decision was clear. The court had acknowledged Madison's efforts to rectify her mistakes. The structured repayment plan had been approved. The original complaint would be suspended pending full execution of the agreement, and if fulfilled within the designated period, the case would be dismissed. No judgment would be recorded, no penalties beyond those already addressed. It was, by legal standards, a second chance. Rebecca folded the letter carefully and set it aside. Madison looked across the desk at her, face unreadable, hands folded in her lap. She didn't ask what the letter meant. She didn't need to. "You did it," Rebecca said softly. "No," Madison replied. "We did." Rebecca didn't contradict her. Outside the window, the day was unusually warm for early spring. The street below bustled with people, small conversations, routine errands. Inside the office, everything felt still, a kind of pause that came not from silence, but from understanding. They had reached a moment that neither of them had imagined would come. Not just the legal end of a process, but the personal recognition that they had somehow rebuilt something long abandoned. Rebecca rose and walked to the window, arms crossed lightly over her chest. Madison followed her gaze. "Do you remember," Madison said suddenly, "when I used to talk about success like it was a show I had to keep putting on?" Rebecca turned, eyebrows raised slightly. "Used to?" Madison gave a soft laugh. "Fair, but I mean back then. I thought if I just looked the part, everything else would fall into place. I didn't understand that looking like something isn't the same as being it." "You're starting to understand now," Rebecca said. "I've been thinking a lot," Madison continued, "about what you said in the courtroom, those words, 'You're lucky this time, I still love you, and I didn't expect them. Not from you, not then.'" Rebecca looked down for a moment, then back at her sister. "Neither did I. They stayed with me," Madison said, her voice quieter. "Not because they made everything better, that they didn't, but because they reminded me that forgiveness isn't always about erasing what happened. Sometimes it's just a way of saying, we can move forward even if we don't forget." Rebecca nodded slowly. It wasn't about erasing. It was about choosing not to let one moment define all the others. Madison leaned forward, resting her arms on her knees. "You were never invisible, you know. I think that's the worst part. You were right there all along, and I just didn't see it." "You weren't looking," Rebecca said, not bitterly, just truthfully. "I was afraid," Madison admitted. "You were always solid. I didn't know how to exist next to that without feeling like I was fading." "And I was tired of existing behind you," Rebecca replied. "Always there, always steady, but never seen. We were living in the same house but in different stories." Madison nodded. "I see you now." The words were simple. They weren't wrapped in dramatics or apology, but they mattered. They filled a space that had remained empty for too long. Rebecca met her sister's gaze and allowed herself to believe it, not just to hear it, but to trust that it came from somewhere real. "I don't want us to go back to how we were," Madison said, "because how we were, it wasn't enough. I want something different now, something that doesn't need to be proven all the time." Rebecca gave a small nod. "Then that's where we start." For a while, they sat in quiet, not because there was nothing left to say, but because some things had already been said in full, not through declarations, but through presence, through choices, through the slow rebuilding of trust, 1 hour at a time. Eventually, Madison stood. She tucked the letter into her bag and looked around the office one last time. "I've got a lot of rebuilding to do," she said, "but I think I'm finally ready to build something real." Rebecca stood with her. "You're not alone." They left the office together, the city bright with sunlight, the streets busy but not overwhelming. For once, they walked not as estranged sisters or cautious allies, but as something new, two people who had faced a truth together and chosen not to retreat from it. Words, once thrown like stones, had become anchors, and now they were becoming bridges. The final days of spring came slowly, with morning breezes that carried warmth without yet releasing the full heat of summer. Rebecca's office remained its usual haven of order and clarity, but something within it had shifted. It wasn't the furniture or the files, those remained in their usual places, but the quiet sense of space that now existed between her and Madison, a space no longer defined by silence but by effort. Since the case had been resolved and the court had deferred judgment in favor of Madison's ongoing repayment plan, their dynamic had taken on a new form. Rebecca still maintained her boundaries, her days filled with consultations, client hearings, and briefings, but Madison was now part of her landscape in a way that felt natural, even earned. She stopped by less frequently, and when she did, it wasn't out of desperation or apology. She came with updates, new questions about her business, even the occasional article to discuss or book recommendation to share. One morning, Madison arrived holding a box. Rebecca glanced up from her computer, surprised by the sight. "I didn't order anything," she said. "It's not for you to keep," Madison replied. "It's for us to look at." She set the box on the table and lifted the lid. Inside were photos, old notebooks, school certificates, and a handful of trinkets from their childhood home, a shared past preserved in the most ordinary ways. Madison picked up a photo and held it between them. "Your 10th birthday," she said. "That awful homemade cake with the crooked candles." Rebecca chuckled softly. "I remember. I wanted a bookstore gift card, and Mom gave me a journal instead." "You filled it in 2 weeks," Madison said, smiling. Rebecca nodded. "I had a lot to say, just no one to say it to." The smile faded slightly, replaced by understanding. They went through the box slowly, not rushing, not skipping over the awkward memories. There were photos from school concerts, family vacations, and holidays. Madison pointed out a bracelet she had made Rebecca when they were kids. Rebecca, surprised she had kept it, ran her fingers over the worn fabric. "I wasn't always cruel," Madison said after a while. "Sometimes I just didn't know how to be kind." Rebecca looked at her. "Kindness isn't a default. It's a decision. I'm learning to choose it more often," Madison replied. Rebecca didn't answer, but her silence wasn't cold. It was a gesture of acknowledgement. Later that week, Madison invited her to coffee, not in an office, not as a client, but as a sister. They met at a small shop downtown, the kind with narrow tables and soft jazz playing overhead. Rebecca arrived with a book in her bag, Madison with her tablet and notes about a new business model she had been sketching. They didn't talk about the past much that day. Instead, they talked about new ideas, simple hopes, and what came next. Madison had decided to relaunch her business under a new name. She was no longer trying to sell image-first products or curated content. This time, she wanted to focus on sustainable materials and local partnerships. She had reached out to vendors, secured smaller, manageable contracts, and created a pricing model that was transparent. Rebecca, listening quietly, asked questions, not to poke holes, but to test strength. Madison answered each one with surprising steadiness. "You've done your research," Rebecca said finally. "I've had good guidance," Madison replied. Rebecca gave a small nod, then added, "Just remember, stability is built slowly. Don't outrun it." "I won't," Madison said. "Not this time." They sat in a comfortable silence after that, sipping coffee, the kind of silence that didn't need filling. Around them, the cafe buzzed with life. Conversations, footsteps, steam from espresso machines. But inside that moment, everything felt calm. A few days later, Rebecca received an unexpected message. Their parents were hosting a family gathering at the house where they had both grown up. A casual afternoon with extended relatives, a barbecue, and no special occasion. The message came not from their mother, but from Madison. "They asked me to send this along, but I want you to know, if you come, I want you there, not out of obligation, out of choice." Rebecca stared at the message for a long time before replying, "I'll be there." The day of the gathering, she arrived in the late afternoon. The house was just as she remembered, the same porch swing, the same driveway cracks, the same hummingbird feeder their father still insisted on refilling. Music drifted from the backyard, and the smell of grilled food hung in the air. Rebecca took a breath, walked up the path, and entered through the side gate. Madison was there, talking with a cousin, her face lit up by the sun. She turned, saw Rebecca, and smiled. Not the smile of performance or guilt, but of welcome. She walked over and gave a light, brief hug. "You came," she said. "You asked," Rebecca replied, and just like that, it no longer felt strange. The rest of the evening unfolded without drama. Family members chatted, laughed, told old stories. Rebecca found herself part of conversations she used to stand outside of, answering questions, sharing updates about her work, even laughing at a few long-forgotten childhood mishaps. Madison didn't hover, didn't insert herself. She simply made space, quietly and intentionally. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon and the lanterns in the yard began to glow, Rebecca sat beside her sister near the back fence, away from the crowd. The hum of voices floated behind them. "This feels different," Madison said. Rebecca nodded. "It is." "Do you think we'll stay like this?" Madison asked. "Or is this just a season?" Rebecca thought for a moment. "It'll depend on us, on how we keep showing up." "I want to," Madison said. "Keep showing up." "Then we have a start," Rebecca replied. They didn't need to say more. The evening, the invitation, the shared space, it all spoke enough. What had once been a fracture had become something else entirely. Not fixed, not forgotten, but chosen. Months passed. The shift in seasons brought subtle changes to the town. Warmer afternoons, later sunsets, a livelier rhythm in the streets. Rebecca moved through her days with the same diligence as always, her work steady, her office orderly, her calendar full. But something inside her had softened. It wasn't visible to most. Clients still knew her as the calm, precise attorney who listened carefully and spoke with weight. But those who paid closer attention, colleagues, friends, and now Madison, could sense the difference. It wasn't change driven by loss or confrontation. It was the kind that came when truth had been spoken and, more importantly, received. When silence was no longer the only thing shared between two people. The courtroom moment that once felt like a tremor had become, over time, a point of quiet origin. From it, something steady had begun to grow. Madison's business relaunch had been small, cautious and intentional. She avoided flash or spectacle. There were no viral campaigns, no exaggerated launches, just clean designs, a transparent website, honest pricing, and partnerships with local artisans. Her products were handmade, her packaging minimal, her mission centered around authenticity. It wasn't about chasing attention anymore. It was about building something she could stand behind. Rebecca watched the evolution without stepping in too often. She remained available, answering questions, reviewing contracts when asked, reminding Madison of tax deadlines and legal obligations, but she no longer needed to hold the structure for her. Madison was learning to carry her own weight. One morning, Rebecca received a package at her office. Inside was a neatly wrapped gift with no card. She opened it carefully. It was a journal, cloth-bound, embossed with the initials RE, and a single line printed on the first page. "Thank you for seeing me, even when I wasn't looking." There was no signature. There didn't need to be. Weeks later, Madison called. "There's something happening next Saturday," she said. "Just a small gathering. I'm not calling it a launch party, but I guess it's kind of that. A thank you for the vendors who took a chance on me and the people who stood by me. Would you come?" Rebecca hesitated for less than a breath. Of course. It wasn't the kind of event she would have attended in the past. She preferred quiet rooms and meaningful conversations to mingling and small talk. But this was different. This wasn't about business, it was about support. The event took place in a renovated studio on the edge of town. Light poured in through tall windows. Tables were lined with samples of Madison's products: linen textiles, handmade soaps, ceramic pieces, and recycled paper stationery. Each item had a story attached, printed on small tags. There were no grand speeches, no spotlight moments, just soft music, wine in mismatched glasses, and people who believed in quiet beginnings. Rebecca walked through the room with calm curiosity. She saw the way Madison moved, not with the overconfidence of the past, but with quiet pride, greeting people warmly, asking questions, listening. This wasn't a performance. It was presence. Eventually, Madison approached her, holding 2 glasses of sparkling water. "You came," she said, smiling. "You invited," Rebecca replied, accepting the glass. They stood side by side, watching a small group examine a display of locally crafted journals. "You know," Madison said after a pause, "I used to think success meant being admired. Now I think it means being trusted." Rebecca turned to her. "Trust lasts longer than applause." Madison nodded. "You taught me that, not by telling me, just by being you." They didn't need to linger on what had come before. The path behind them was still there, but it no longer defined them. They had reached a place not of resolution, but of shared direction. Their relationship didn't need to be perfect. It only needed to be real. As the evening wore on, Rebecca sat on a bench near the window, watching the warm light stretch across the floor. A few guests left quietly. Others chatted in corners. Madison moved between them with ease, a host in her own space, not commanding attention but deserving it. Rebecca felt no need to insert herself, no desire to supervise or advise. She was simply there, and that was enough. Later, as the crowd thinned, Madison joined her on the bench. They sat in silence, the kind that didn't ask for filling. Outside, the sky had turned to dusk, the first stars just beginning to appear. "I think I finally understand what you meant," Madison said quietly. "About what?" "About being seen. It's not about who's looking. It's about whether you're willing to stand in the light as you are." Rebecca turned slightly toward her. "And are you?" Madison took a breath. "I am now." They sat there a while longer, not planning the future, not rehashing the past, just existing in the present, side by side, steady and honest. When they stood to leave, Madison walked her to the door. "Thanks for coming," she said. Rebecca looked at her and replied, "Thanks for asking." There was no ceremony to mark what had changed between them. No grand reconciliation speech or dramatic apology. Just this, a different kind of reunion. One built not on obligation or history, but on the choice to begin again, this time with both eyes open. And when Rebecca stepped out into the night, the air was cool, the stars were clear, and for the first time in years, the road behind her and the path ahead felt connected. Not perfect, but whole. But